Every story that touches on freedom is bound to explore the nebulous idea of fate, whether that is explicitly clear or not. The correlation between the topics is so widely discussed in so many forms that I don't even feel the need to explain. It is a philosophical quandary that stretches across centuries, and engaging with it requires you to hop on an incessant upward spiral of reading the subject in broader and broader contexts. While I think abstraction is fun to indulge in, it's not necessarily conducive to productive dialogue. Immanuel Kant is known for many things, and one of those things is the following quote: "Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind." It's been rephrased over the years to say that theory without practice and practice without theory are both equally lacking in direction and substance. Every philosophy should be stress tested with this maxim, and whether or not the fate versus free will dialogue holds up is reliant on the context in which it is discussed. All of this is to say, I absolutely love stories that incorporate this dialogue. If you go through a list of my favorite fiction, you'll struggle to find one where fate versus free will is not core to the story's identity. It is a big part of why I love a lot of the stories I do. Vagabond, Attack on Titan, Bleach, only to name just a few, contextualize the dialogue over the course of several chapters. They are wildly different stories, yet the aforementioned common thread persists. And most crucially, they aren't simply canvases for the respective author's rendition of fate versus free will. They are each their own synthesis. Each of them revolve around a new answer that characters within the story arrive at, and a new conclusion that may or may not formatively contribute to your own take on the matter. Personally, Vagabond was instrumental for contextualizing my own beliefs. But this is a Bleach video, and Bleach explores these ideas in a way that really stands out to me because it corporealizes these concepts. Fate versus free will is no longer a vague and abstract existential struggle, it is a war waged against a being threatening the universe's extinction. The concepts are made physical, they are living and breathing, and this is by no means juvenile or wacky, nor does it rob the topic of its complexity or profundity by utilizing this sort of fantastical characterization. If anything, characters attempting to become stand-ins or even overlords of fate in a setting where corporeal entities do in fact control abstract concepts makes the commentary conducted by Kubo significantly more interesting. The series sets itself up just right to come at the relationship of fate and free will from a relatively unique angle. What if you actually had the power? What difference would that make, if any at all? Similarly to my most recent Aizen video, today I will be visiting a topic that is fairly well discussed within the Bleach community to hopefully introduce new talking points. This is a topic that practically every single fan of Bleach has at least thought of or discussed to some degree. It wouldn't take very long for anyone that's active in the Bleach community to come across an analysis or a love letter to the series that characterizes Bleach as a story about fate and its impositions. The major takeaway of the finale is that Ichigo shattered fate. This interpretation is so prevalent that countless people theorize that breaking the figurative red string is Ichigo's actual Bankai ability, and I don't necessarily disagree with this idea that Ichigo shattered fate. However, as I said, I'd like to try and widen the scope of the discussion because I think the conversation is dominated by conclusions drawn from looking at just half the picture. The other half of the picture is made up of very deliberate narrative decisions made by Kubo to say that Ichigo was in fact acting within the confines of fate for the entire story. The very act of defeating Yhwach, an act to which the quality of shattering fate is assigned, was also predetermined. I will be delving deeper into this claim over the course of the video, but before that I think it's important to firmly lay down my stance on this matter as a whole, as a sort of premeditated measure to diminish the potential knee-jerk reactions to how the stuff I'm saying might sound. Ichigo's victory over Yhwach being predetermined does not take away from the work it took to happen. It doesn't remove Ichigo's free will from the equation. It does not minimize the personal breakthroughs that almost the entire cast experienced, milestones that were necessary for them to step up and meet the challenge before them. In fact, I don't think that the predetermined quality of the victory that Ichigo and his friends achieved over the Quincy army is even a counter to the notion that the fate that was about to be imposed by the one that called himself its overlord was shattered. And I'm well aware that this probably sounds contradictory and paradoxical. But bear with me, because the idea that an act of defiance of fate can still be predetermined is something central to the thesis of this video. And that thesis concerns a philosophical offshoot of the aforementioned dialogue between determinism and free will, compatibilism, the philosophy of Bleach, as the title suggests. The idea that free will is, as the name suggests, compatible with determinism. Free will can coexist with determinism, not fate, because that's slightly different, and I'll cover that a little later on. Now, here's an important disclaimer. The following couple of minutes are going to be a largely technical overview of the concept that Bleach and a lot of other manga utilize in their thematic framework. While you don't need a thorough understanding of the concept, because I definitely don't have one myself, I do think it is important to understand the basics. If you don't think you need one, feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter of the video. While I'd love to explain compatibilism as some kind of a unified theory, it isn't, so I can't. It's more of a response to incompatibilists who believe that if the world operates on a system of causal determinism, our free will and moral responsibility for our actions are ruled out. The idea here is that because the causal factors of our actions and inactions can be traced back to other events, and the same factors of those events can be traced even further back, and so on, we aren't the causal source of what we do today, what we do now. Our actions don't stem from us, so we can't claim those actions as ours. We can't rightly say that those are our actions that we did out of our own free will, and we cannot be said to be able to do anything other than what we ultimately do. Compatibilists disagree with this notion on various fronts. First of all, if the world does operate on a system of causal determinism, there's nothing to suggest that we can be stopped from doing other things. Other compatibilists go further and disagree with the root of this idea, that such freedom to do other things is even required to say we have free will across the board. Some go further still and say that this kind of freedom to do other things is barely even connected to morally responsible agency. Like I said, compatibilism is not a unified theory, it's the antithesis of a pre-existing idea. I'll leave a link to the article about compatibilism from Stanford Encyclopedia in the description for any of you that's interested in learning more about the subject. But for the purpose of this video, my explanation should suffice. As mentioned earlier, the integration of compatibilism in manga is almost a constant thanks to Buddhism's strong presence in Japan, which as a religion can be viewed as a compatibilist philosophy. Vagabond is one of the clearest examples of this, since Takuan all but explains the concept the same way I have. All of our individual paths, they've been preordained by the heavens, and it's for that very reason that we are free. Obviously, Bleach doesn't contend with spiritual ideas as they are, it's an allegorical story. Its depiction of compatibilism is done in the form of illusions, events acting as puzzle pieces for us to put together. I explained in the 2-hour essay I released about the Aizen and Yhwach dynamic that the former represents determinism and the latter represents fatalism. This is a very significant difference, seeing as how compatibilism is an ideology that asserts the coexistence of free will and a system of causal determinism. Seems like there's no room for fate here, considering determinism is a bottom-up approach. Links between cause and effect are the subject of study here, and missing links cannot exist. Fatalism is the belief that regardless of the causal chain, certain outcomes are guaranteed. They're simply fated to happen no matter what came prior. Yhwach's almighty is fatalism manifest. The story, in its depiction of Yhwach's power, never once really concerns itself with the steps leading up to a certain event. The certain event is a certainty regardless. So it appears that fatalism has no place in the compatibilist framework. The question then is, why did Kubo introduce it into the conversation at all, if that was the case? To answer that, we need to go back to the basics, analyze the conversation and its constituent components from the ground up. Every major antagonist in Bleach is about the assertion of control, and this control manifests in the form of narrative control more often than not. It even extends to figures that toe the line between protagonist and antagonist, like Kisuke briefly and Ichigo. With the latter especially, the whole orchestrator mentality is very evident, and when you study this obsession with control in a broader context, the ideas of determinism and fatalism later on are painfully evident. The best place to begin exploring this angle is of course our very own Reo reject, Aizen Sosuke. Aizen traced the causal links of events taking place in the present back to the original sin. He felt his own free will was robbed by the truth of the universe, by the first link in the chain of history, the sealing and mutilation of the Soul King a million years ago. So he sought to replace the very origin point of the universe. He would therefore be the causal source of everything, including his own actions, which is most noteworthy. This is never explicitly stated, but it's a natural consequence of his mentality. Aizen was fighting against the deterministic state of the world and aiming to reinstate his own free will. And in order to prepare for, and more importantly to embody the role he was sure he'd place himself in, Aizen orchestrated events, manipulated people, and restructured entire realms. Let's quickly run through some key instances, which will help contextualize the answer he finally receives to his challenge, the answer provided by Kurosaki Ichigo in their eventual confrontation. Aizen's control began with the complete subversion of the Soul Society arc. He orchestrated the entire course of events revolving around Rukia's execution, casting Byakuya as a surrogate antagonist in his play. It's all just theatre to Aizen, as the puppet master hidden behind the curtains pulling every single string. Byakuya, a man defined by his adherence to the law, was unknowingly turned into a pawn, his personal philosophies and internal conflicts exploited to serve Aizen's narrative. This individual manipulation was underpinned by institutional control, which Aizen achieved by murdering and impersonating the entire Central 46. He became the very system he was pretending to serve, weaponizing its stagnancy and rigid rules against its followers to create the chaos he needed for his own goals. What's really cool about this is that it essentially functions as a micro-expression of his ultimate goal. Taking the place of Central 46 and calling the shots, becoming the ruler of the Soul Society from the shadows, is almost exactly what he wanted to do upon ascending to Heaven's throne. The Central 46 are viewed as a conduit between the Shinigami and the Soul King up above, and as we come to learn, the Soul King has no agency and doesn't call any shots, making the Central 46 the closest thing to a real ruler of Soul Society aside from Ichibe. And Ichibe does not concern himself with what happens outside his jurisdiction. He is wholly focused on the Soul King Palace and maintaining the current shape of the universe. That is the only thing he cares about. He is the final line of defense for the world, and he leaves the actual management of Soul Society to Central 46. That's the source of Aizen's anger. He believes the strongest should rule directly from the throne, so stealing that role of management by impersonating Central 46 is a lovely nod to what Aizen envisions for the end of his path, and this role's relation to fate is very obvious. He literally uses this position during the Soul Society arc to seal the fate of Rukia Kuchiki, turning almost the entire Gotei 13 into mindless drones to carry out his orders and have her executed. Even the brother of his target submits to this fate, but there are others who stand and fight against the system as well, notably having been influenced by Ichigo's charisma. Our main character is the walking, talking embodiment of free will and agency, especially during the Soul Society arc, and his indomitable spirit echoes throughout the entire story and causes so many others to also fight against the tides of fate. Yet crucially, that same indomitable spirit is exactly what renders Ichigo the ultimate fatality in moments where he is overpowered. Back to Aizen though. After abandoning Soul Society once it had served his needs, he restructured the desolate realm of Hueco Mundo into a dark mirror of the world he left behind. He established his rule not on loyalty, not on a code of ethics, but on a carefully managed system of fear, positioning himself as both the source of the Arrancar's terror and their only solution for survival. Once again, another micro-expression of what he eventually hoped to achieve in the Soul Society, and in turn the entire cosmos once he made himself the Soul King. His palace, Las Noches, and his elite soldiers, the Espada, were hollow imitations of the royal palace in the Gotei 13, creating an artificial balance in an unchanging world. Las Noches literally translates to the nights, and Ryokyu can be viewed as the sun of the cosmos, the thing everything revolves around, similar to our solar system. So we have a dichotomy between the eternally night and the eternally day. The Espada themselves, in his eyes, were mere extensions of his psyche, with Aizen assigning them their aspects of death to reframe their whole identities within his narrative. Absolute control, hidden underneath an almost see-through true veil he called salvation. Of course, it's worth mentioning that Aizen's most meticulously controlled subject was none other than himself, his own persona. And I'm not just talking about the kind, compassionate captain we all know to be a very calculated performance designed to mask his true intentions. I'm talking about this dude, constantly gesticulating about his own greatness. This guy is a fraud. He is a carefully woven facade. Aizen severed personal bonds with clinical precision, viewing these relationships as imperfections to be cut away in a form of self-mutilation on his path to a perceived godhood. And in the process, he rendered himself hollow, no different or perhaps even more empty than the beings he ruled over with an attitude of patronizing superiority. My most recent video on him is wholly dedicated to exploring this aspect of the character if you'd like to hear more. But the main thing of note for the purpose of this discussion is that all of these power plays led to one thing: the final challenge, the one person he had built up to be his final foil. Aizen acted as the author of Ichigo's entire existence, his influence extending back to the meeting of his parents and the creation of the experimental Hollow White, which would later become a core of Ichigo's true power. It would even show up repeatedly to save Ichigo during the Soul Society arc, which is the same plot Aizen directly needed him for the most. Every major event in Ichigo's life, up to their eventual confrontation, was a deliberate move on Aizen's board, designed to groom him as the ultimate research subject and the final bond he would sever to mark his ascension. He sent Rukia to him, which introduced him to the world of Shinigami. He tipped off Rukia's whereabouts, which led Byakuya and Renji to him, not only giving Ichigo one of his most agonizing defeats, but teaching him that he needs to grow more powerful, Aizen knowing that this would steer Urohara in his direction and result in the invasion of Soul Society. It is an incredibly elaborate master plan. Aizen has his Keikaku reputation for good reason, regardless of how much people overdo it sometimes. It's everywhere, down to the most minute details, like the surveillance bug watching Ichigo's battle with the Menos Grande, which Aizen sent himself by the way, or the Reiatsu detection goggles he provided to Renji. It really does feel like Aizen Sosuke is worthy of being considered the architect of Ichigo's fate. But there's a fatal irony to this entire ordeal. The source of it all, the day it all began for the relationship between Ichigo and Aizen before the former was even born. The weapon he wields to crush Ichigo's spirit in this iconic moment is not at all what Aizen tries to make it seem. It's a miracle, which does make it something that warrants being attached to fate, only this fate lies completely outside of Aizen's control. Aizen stopped Torsen from disposing of Masaki when she showed up to protect Isshin and interfered with Aizen's experiments, Torsen literally referring to her as an unplanned event. Then, by what can only really be described as a twist of fate, White reached the metastasized phase and merged with Masaki's soul, which is where Ichigo's inner hollow came from and the basis of his relationship with Aizen was formed. Aizen did have an active hand in some aspects of this miracle, but it is significant that it is Aizen's inaction, his choice to watch what happens, his role as a spectator for a scene he initially had no interest in, was what made way for the better part of Ichigo's conflicts. Yet he adamantly claims to be the orchestrator of every facet of Ichigo's life till that point, since before you were born, which seems like a bit of a silly thing to say when you think about that statement critically. Obviously it still fits the bill because it was still a conscious decision by Aizen to let it happen, but he didn't actually cause it at all. He had no way of knowing that White, the being he deemed a failed experiment, would choose to merge its soul with a Quincy of all things, the existence furthest from itself. He would have loved to be the causal source. He spun that entire sequence of events to make it seem like he was, no matter how untrue he knows that to be. But to Ichigo, the threat of that statement being true is very real. Aizen's overwhelming charisma and seeming omnipotence made it seem possible, and Ichigo has always considered himself the sum of his choices. He's only as strong as his last hard choice. Take that away from him and who is he? This question plagues him to the point of causing a complete breakdown of his will right before Deicide begins. The answer Ichigo arrives at is as multifaceted as the challenge was, but the core of this answer is as follows. From Ichigo's perspective, Aizen may have orchestrated the choices of Ichigo Kurosaki, the individual. He contended and overpowered his comrades one by one as individual forces, but in doing so he missed the forest for the trees as their collaborative efforts, their collective unity catches him off guard. The bond that Ichigo had with others, his dad and especially Zangetsu in this case, birthed more choices for Ichigo to opt for than were computed by Aizen. Ichigo essentially hacked the game that Aizen placed him in through the help of others, like calling in co-op support against an Elden Ring boss. Yes, the circumstances that Ichigo fought in were perfectly constructed by Aizen, but the growth that Ichigo showcases was all thanks to him, his choices, his bonds, his personality. Aizen couldn't take that away with his revelation that he'd orchestrated every bit of Ichigo's life, because Ichigo simply doesn't let that fact take anything away from him. It's the way things are, and so be it. Orchestrations from the shadows were nowhere near enough to dampen the value of the life he had lived. In this battle in the real Karakura town, its name in Japanese evoking the imagery of an empty seat in the sky, a heavenly location, Ichigo gains a taste of true transcendence. In this form, Kubo gives more power to Ichigo's choices and his bonds, things Aizen had discarded, than the circumstances that were constructed for him. His decisions and the resultant growth are all his own to boast of, and that is why he mops the floor with Aizen in one of the most humiliating defeats for a main villain across fiction. But in no way does this invalidate the objective fact that Aizen was behind so many turns in Ichigo's life. Ichigo's assertion that he maintains his free will amounts to exactly that. He maintains his free will. That doesn't consequently destroy the idea of determinism in the story, especially not when Aizen himself was operating under that framework. This coexistence of polar ideas is where the compatibilist ideas stem from. But then comes the 1,000-year Blood War, and this conclusion that Ichigo had reached was put through the ringer by Yhwach. Forget about actively orchestrating his life. Forget about the mind games. Forget about charisma and the power to instill fear. Forget about every part of Aizen's methodology. What if every choice Ichigo made inadvertently benefited Yhwach? Without regard for the chain of cause and effect, without concern for comprehension by others, Yhwach simply reaped the benefits of everyone's actions. That old guy in your soul, the one who's given you your power, the one who's carried you through hell and back, that's me. You're looking at him. The introduction of Yhwach into the story, followed up with Everything But the Rain, completely reframes the reader's perception of Aizen Sosuke in a bid to establish the true terror of the final villain. It's all deliberately designed to make you and Ichigo question everything you thought you knew about the role of the previous main villain. It turns out the thing that really makes Aizen so special, while paradoxically lowering his status in the world and rendering him just like any other living being, is that he embraces the Wheel of Fate, the flow of time. He's curious, he wants to see what will happen next because he has the courage to continue walking forward despite whatever the future may hold. This is the real Aizen. The Aizen we knew, the persona he embodied, it was all a very elaborate lie. He was simply playing the role of fate incarnate, the role of a deity whose palm Ichigo was trapped on. In essence, he was playing the role of Yhwach, and their respective methodology is what illustrates the key distinction between determinism and fatalism in the framework of Bleach, as Aizen played an active role designing a path for Ichigo to follow, while Yhwach remained in slumber, simply biding his time until it was right to strike and stealing all of Aizen's work performed on Ichigo like a parasite. Yhwach didn't need to do anything, everything just happened in a way that aligned with his ideal. The essence of Yhwach's antagonism, framed through the lens we're using in this video, is simple. Previously, Ichigo reclaimed moral responsibility over his choices by breaking free of the shackles Aizen had chained him in. By simply overcoming Aizen in power, he reinstated his own free will after having it stripped from him by Aizen's grand reveal in 397. But Yhwach questions if Ichigo is truly strong enough to do so, not just in terms of power, but in the metaphysical sense, since every one of those choices he made, unbeknownst to him, were in service of Yhwach. They benefited the man who now endangers everything Ichigo holds dear. He questions whether Ichigo is even capable of defying him in any sense. That's why it's significant that it was Ichigo who sliced the Ryo in half, just as Yhwach foresaw. It's Yhwach's way of enforcing the idea that it was Ichigo's choices that got them into this mess, and it is Ichigo's choices that flow exactly according to Yhwach's vision. He weaponizes the very tool Ichigo used to overcome Aizen against him. Of course, there's a catch here as well. The key point is that Ichigo did slice the Reo in half, and he did so twice. He couldn't control himself the first time around and sliced the nugget that held the former Soul King in half. The reason he couldn't control himself, as stated by Yhwach himself, is that he carries the blood of the Quincy King within him, and thus he couldn't forgive the existence of the Reo. He was fated to kill him, and so he did. And then Mimihagi appears and sacrifices himself to keep the Soul King together for a bit longer. This is the only time in the story where we see Yhwach at a crossroads, without a clear path in front of him. In that sense, it can be said the choice to absorb Mimihagi is the only real choice Yhwach ever made, and it was one he was forced to make by the one being who exists outside of his fatalistic framework. In doing so, he takes the place of the Soul King. He was forced to become the very thing he despised most, the linchpin of the worlds. He planned to remain the Soul King temporarily for only as long as he needed to finish up his objectives, but during that window he functioned as the Soul King, and Ichigo, bound by the same fate as before, fated to kill the Soul King, sliced Yhwach in two, in a near identical fashion to the way he sliced his father in two. The visual framing of that scene in the manga is such that the body of Yhwach is right in the center of the page, with thick black borders painted in such a way that it looks like one of the almighty eyes that Yhwach had after absorbing Mimihagi. And Ichigo's blade slashed through the almighty eye as well, but not completely. The eye that sees all and controls all is only half destroyed. To me, the intent with this deliberate choice in visual storytelling is unmistakable, and in retrospect, I've also come to read it as an indictment of the overly simplistic, strong, black and white stance of Ichigo shattering fate, a stance that unfortunately dominates the conversation regarding the conclusion of the story, especially when you consider the mirrored motivations and conclusions reached by Ichigo and Yhwach and their relation to fate. By slicing Yhwach in two, Ichigo ultimately preserved the fixed shapes of life and death, the cycle of existence, what one could consider the ultimate form of fate. And so then it could easily be argued that Yhwach was actually the one intending to shatter fate, and Ichigo stood as the force maintaining its structure. Fate in Bleach is layered, abstract and multifaceted. It is integrated on a variety of levels and serves equally as many functions, which is why reducing this conclusion to a single triumphant act of breaking destiny misses the deeper nuance of what's truly at play. The storytelling conducted by the almighty eyes runs even deeper, with the importance of the number of pupils in the eyes of those who possess the almighty being stressed upon when we learn that Yhwach originally had 2 pupils, which then turned into 3. Then there's the fact that his father, the original Soul King, had 4 pupils. There's a pattern to be derived here, founded upon the knowledge we have that the original Soul King foresaw all the events of the 1000-year Blood War. In conjunction with the fact that 3-pupil Yhwach outclasses his 2-pupil self, it clearly goes to show that the more pupils you have, the more powerful your almighty is. But there's also another common denominator. The only one with the most powerful variant of the almighty is also the only wielder who is perfectly immobile and unable to effectuate anything, even with all that knowledge. Stripped of all agency, literally incapable of moving forward nor backwards, left hanging in a crystal with no arms and no legs. A visual quirk with the almighty wielders is that the 3-pupil variants, Yhwach and Yugaram respectively, retain exactly 1 pupil that remains in the same place that their original singular pupil occupied. In other words, among the 3 pupils in each eye, one always looks straight ahead, just like everyone else's. They're able to look forward onto their path, and more importantly, they're able to take action. They retain their agency, their freedom in will. This is a luxury that is not afforded to the original Soul King, although it does come at the expense of some foresight, or rather, absolute foresight. Yhwach's assessment of his own power that the Almighty isn't simply the power to peer into the future, it's the power to affect it, is incomplete at best, and outright wrong at worst. After all, the 4-pupil variant of the Almighty gives the Soul King the ability to see in all directions. He can see everything, he knows everything, but he can't see forward. His own path ends right there. Keep in mind that these are inferences I'm drawing from the visual language of the manga. This is an analysis that lends itself to the thematic framework much more than it does lore extrapolation. There's no outright explanation for these things, but Kubo is a man of poetry, and the bulk of Bleach is rooted in these visual inferences and poetic implications. Anyway, what's significant about what we've discussed so far is the anime original sequence of Ichibei subjecting Ichigo through some kind of metaphysical trial as part of the Royal Guard training. Centuries and centuries of history and memory flows into Ichigo's head, and the imprint of that omniscience, the 4 pupils, are briefly superimposed onto each of Ichigo's eyes. Yet crucially, Ichigo's central pupil, the one that only looks straight ahead, the one that allows him to move forward, is never lost. It remains fixed, and that is what disqualifies him as a worthy Soul King replacement in Ichibe's eyes, in my opinion. What Ichibe seeks is a motionless vessel, a docile linchpin to hold the realms in place, a still point in the turning worlds. Ichigo is anything but that. He is what makes the worlds turn. This is the answer the story arrives at. Cause and effect can only be traced up so far, but that limitation doesn't strip you of your choices, and sometimes your choices can have some terrible consequences. You just have to own them. Just like Ichigo owned the consequences of his choice to slice through the Soul King the second time around, to rob the world of its chance to enter a new age of deathlessness. And he owned this choice together with Orihime, creating a new life to affirm their place in the eternal cycle of life and death. You will never truly grasp the full extent of everything that goes on in the world. Most of us can barely comprehend everything that directly concerns us, much less everything ever. The pursuit of such absolute knowledge tends to cripple you. There's even a term for it that a lot of people like to use, analysis paralysis. I struggle with that myself when it comes to scripting these videos. Hell, I struggled with that with this video. Being so caught up in acquiring what you mistakenly believe is the necessary amount of knowledge to drive your actions, that you must first know everything before you can act, all that does is keep you rooted to the spot, stagnant, unable to move out of fear that you don't know enough and consequently aren't prepared enough. So maybe Bleach's tango with fatalism doesn't fit within the compatibilist narrative that constitutes more than half of the series, but I believe it to be completely necessary regardless. It brings the very first quote that Bleach gave us, "We fear that which we cannot see," full circle. Keep moving. That should be your choice against the overwhelming fear of lack of knowledge. Maybe even that choice to keep moving is predetermined, just like the choices Ichigo made were, but not even the Overlord of Fate could take that choice away from you. That choice is still entirely yours to make. Thank you all so very much for watching. Please do like the video if you enjoyed, and check my Patreon, which is linked in the description if you'd like to support me further. I'll see you guys in the next one.